By the time we get to chapter 4 of Joshua, the people have now crossed the Jordan River. But prior to the beginning of the conquest of the land, and their first battle would be with Jericho, prior to that, there was a number of other things that had to be accomplished and done before that would happen. So we're going to look at that in chapters 4 and a little bit in chapter 5 at this time. So what needed to take place? Well, first of all, in verse 3 of chapter 4, they were to set up 12 stones here out of the middle of the Jordan, and they were to take them down as far as verses 6 and 7 to a place called Gilgal. And it says that when your children ask later on, what do these stones mean? You shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off from the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed the Jordan, and the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. So 12 stones were taken out of, these are pretty good sized stones, taken out of the Jordan River, piled up at Gilgal, and they are going to be a perpetual memorial to the people of what God had done. This is not uncommon in Israel. God is constantly setting up memorials of one kind or the other to point them back to what God had done, and often saying these very words, that when your children ask you about this or that, then you will say this to them. So that's the first thing that was done there. Secondly, Joshua is exalted, verse 14, just as God had promised in chapter 3. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel. Joshua is their leader now. Moses is gone, and they see him as God's appointed leader, and he's exalted. In verse 24, these events demonstrate that God is mighty. The mighty hand of God is revealed. All the people of earth shall know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that they may fear the Lord your God forever. And so these events, the things God is doing, these wonders, are demonstrating not only to Israel, but to everyone that he is the mighty God of the world. Just like we saw back in chapter 2, the people of Jericho should have known who God really was, and Rahab did. God is demonstrating who he is, and most of the people are going to reject that. But now in chapter 5, we jump ahead of that for just a moment. As the hearts of the people were melted away, God says, I want you to circumcise the sons of Israel a second time in verse 2, and that goes through verse 7. As he talks about this, the people that came out of Egypt were circumcised, but apparently this generation had not been. And the circumcision was not just a physical act, it was a sign of the covenant with Abraham. It was actually the sign, and we find that back in Genesis chapter 15. And so that they had not done that before tells them they needed to do that as a sign of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of the covenant that he would keep with them. And then a very interesting thing, starting with verse 11 of chapter 5, we find now that on that very day, they began eating some of the produce of the land. And on that day, verse 12, manna ceased at that point. Now, they had been eating manna for almost 40 years now, well, actually 40 years. And that has sustained them all those years. And now, on the very day that they are now in a land where they can eat of the produce of the land flowing with milk and honey, remember, is often said in the Old Testament, they now no longer need the manna. Now, imagine they got up that morning, went out to look, and it wasn't there. And then they started looking around, and well, here's grapes, and here's seeds, and here whatever, and they start developing appetites for other foods. They're probably ready for that after all those years of eating the manna. And then verses 13 to 15, Joshua gives them assurance that God is going before them. He says, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? He said, no, rather, I indeed have come as the captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Joshua needed to know, he'd been exalted and he's their leader, but he needed to know that God was with them. And so the captain of the Lord's host, so is going to be leading them in power and might. Joshua needed to know that. And in turn, the people of Israel needed to know that. And it's interesting, too, that he tells them, verse 19, to take his sandals off his feet because he's standing on holy ground, just as had been said to Moses back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. Just almost identical account. And the ground was holy not because certain pieces of real estate were sacred. That's paganism, I believe, but because God had sanctioned it. God was there. God's presence was there. And that made the ground holy. Take your sandals off because you're standing on ground that God has set aside for himself by his very presence. Joshua does, and now they're ready for the conquest of Jericho.